Alister, I, like you, did a doctorate in the biological sciences, but whereas you became a professional theologian, I became an investment banker, but still had a great interest in theology. So I come to you with some questions. I'm particularly interested in natural theology, but there are subtle definitions, and I'd love to hear you tell me about it.
Well, the easiest way of understanding what natural theology is to say it basically means looking at the natural world and saying in some way this signposts a transcendent dimension. In other words, you look at the natural world and in some way it's pointing you beyond itself to the transcendent or to God. And in many ways, the easiest way of defining natural theology is to say that humanity, without any existing knowledge of God, just by using our natural faculties, can look at the world and say that suggests, or maybe that proves, there is a God.
Now, generally that is contradicted to revealed theology. So revealed theology is a totally different character.
Well, for many people, revealed theology would be in tension with natural theology. In other words, natural theology might be seen as this is what we as human beings can do under our own steam without any need for divine revelation. Divine revelation is something different. But here's the question: what if divine revelation said there is something about the natural world that indeed points in this direction?
So then they're synergistic.
Exactly. Think of, for example, the psalmist. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Now, if that's right, then maybe there's a synergy between natural theology and revealed theology. They're not in tension. They're actually working together.
But in recent centuries, I would feel that natural theology has lost a little bit of its fervor among philosophers and even theologians. I think more recently there's been a resurgence of it, but there was a period of time where it was going into disfavor. Is that right?
I think that's right. Certainly, I would say that from about 1950 onwards, in other words, just after the Second World War, people were very suspicious of it. They were suspicious for theological reasons, like Karl Barth's idea. If God's revealed himself, why do we need natural theology? Isn't that actually subversive? Let's forget about that. Or indeed, philosophically, many philosophers would argue, look, there is no bridge between the world of experience and the world of God. But I think you're right. I think in more recent years, since about 2000, there's been a growing interest in rebuilding natural theology. Partly, I think, because of this growing interest in the relationship between science and religion. And natural theology, it seems to me, is the natural area of dialogue between the sciences and theology.
There's probably another factor that in the last decade or two, there's been this tremendous resurgence in cosmological data, which points to a fine-tuning, and it causes arguments on all sides, but it brings the issue to the fore more so than in past decades.
Well, I think you're right, and certainly this whole issue of fine-tuning, it doesn't prove anything, but it's very, very suggestive, and certainly that's made many people think, look, maybe the world has been set up in such a way as to bring life into existence. And again, while that doesn't prove anything, it's very, very suggestive. It's a reason, but not a proof for the existence of a creator God.
It puts the subject front and center. So you have to deal with it one way or the other.
Certainly, a number of cosmologists have made the subject of major importance, so you can't really talk about cosmology without being confronted with this question: is the world made in such a way that life had to come into existence?
So natural theology is an important topic. It's on the front burner of the debate about theology, about God in the public consciousness.
It's come back onto the front burner, and that would surprise many people, but certainly it has happened, and it seems to me to be an enormously stimulating, productive area of discussion.
Now, you have taken a very interesting approach to natural theology. You have developed a scientific theology, which sounds like it is a subset, or at least an overlap, and I'd like to discuss that a little bit. Now, what is a scientific theology as you have devised it?
Well, if we look at the history of Christian theology, what we find is that Christian theology has lent on dialogue partners. In other words, it's said, look, Platonism is saying some very interesting things. We can learn from that. Aristotelianism is saying some very interesting, we can learn from that. What I'm saying is the sciences are using certain methods, and theology can learn from that. In many ways, a scientific theology is about a principled dialogue between Christian theology and the natural sciences, and immediately that propels natural theology right to the front as the key item on that agenda.
Well, it's going both directions, because the natural theology, you look at the natural world to infer, is there something there of a transcendent nature? And you're using, though, in a parallel but different sense, to look at the natural world to see if the principles of how that works can help the theological dialogue and the theological understanding. It's fascinating.
Exactly. And in many ways what I'm saying is, look, if we kind of step into this worldview and look at the world with this lens, this prism, it makes an awful lot more sense than anything else. And therefore, for me, that's a very important argument for this approach actually having some validity.
You've called it a system. Now, what is part of a system of scientific theology?
Well, a system is not just a series of elements, it's a series of interactive elements. And what I argue is that a scientific theology brings together the idea of God as creator, the idea of the world as showing order, the idea of, for example, the world in some way pointing beyond itself, and many, many other things, and saying, look, these are not isolated elements. They actually are parts of a bigger picture. And in many ways, what I'm saying is that Christian theology gives us the building blocks to understand what this bigger picture is, and to be able to stand back and appreciate and say, this makes sense.
You also say, I think, with your scientific hat on, that this is not proof of belief, but it is support of belief.
Exactly. And I mean, we can't prove belief in the sense that I can say 2 and 2 makes 4. Right. What we can say, though, is that, look, this makes an awful lot of sense. In fact, this makes more sense than the alternatives. And certainly, if you think of the philosophical debate, you might think of this whole debate about inference to the best explanation. Yes. There are many explanations, but they're not all equally good. And the question is, which is the best? And for me, Christian theology offers the best explanation of the way things are. Let me give you a quote from C.S. Lewis, who I love. C.S. Lewis once said,
Being at Oxford,
of course, and an Irishman too. C.S. Lewis once said, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And it's this wonderful idea of a kind of intellectual framework, interesting in itself, but even more interesting because it makes sense of other things.
You have divided your scientific theology into 3 broad categories, if I get this right: nature, reality, and theory. Tell me a little bit about each one.
In nature, I make the point that there is a very significant debate about exactly what that word nature means. And certainly in the Enlightenment period, people thought nature designated something that was self-evidently correct. What we've realized now is that there are so many different definitions of nature that in effect that there's no right way of looking at nature. And I therefore make the point that the Christian doctrine of creation gives us a way of looking at nature which is at least as good as anything else and makes a lot of sense of it. And if it's right, it leads on into other areas. And so what I try to do is say, let's follow this through and see where it takes us.
I notice you're referring to the Christian doctrine of creation, and in your structure, in your system of scientific theology, the creation is exceedingly important as more than a benchmark, but really a core.
Well, that's absolutely right. And for me, if God is creator, then it says some extremely important things, not simply about the natural world, but also about us. Because here's one of the key questions. Why is it that we can make sense of nature? Why does science work? And for me, the answer is that the same God who made us and our patterns of thinking also made the world. So there's a resonance, a synergy between the way we are and the way the world is, because we are both creations of the same God. And that seems to me to really help us as we think about these issues.
And therefore, if we can understand the world, which we do, which we assume to be sort of self-evident, but if you think about it, is not necessarily so. That is an indicator that they come from the same source. Is that the...
Exactly. It seems to me that the explicability of nature requires explanation. Why can we make sense of things? It's not self-evident at all. There has to be a reason for it. And one of the best reasons is that the one who made us made that. And in some way, there's a synergy between us and the way the world is. It didn't have to be that way, but it is.
And as you've said, there are other explanations. You just happen to think that one's the best. Other people think another is best. That's the one you think is best.
Exactly. This is a debate, but it's very important to get this component of the debate onto the table.
Second category, reality.
What I argue here is that the success of the sciences is best explained as there is something out there that we are responding to. We're not inventing our ideas, we're actually responding to the way things are. Similarly, I argue, theology is about trying to respond to the way things are. Now, obviously, we have to use intermediaries, models or analogies to do this, but the key point is that theology and the natural sciences are a principled attempt to make sense of the way things are. We're controlled by that. We're responding to that.
Final category, theory.
Science develops theory. In other words, we look at the world, we see things. What explanation can we offer? Theory is an attempt to make sense of the world. Theology is about theory, trying to make sense of things, trying to say, here is what we need to say about God or about Jesus Christ or about the world to make sense of things as they are. And sure, there are those who say, look, Christianity would be much better off if we didn't have these wretched doctrines. I'm saying, look, we need these things because part of what the Christian vision of reality is all about is making sense of things. Doctrine is Christian theory. We need it to make sense of the way things are.
So if you pull it all together, what is your view now of natural theology as opposed to when you started on this journey?
Well, pulling it all together, it seems to me natural theology is a bold and brilliant vision of the world which says, look, if God made the world and made us, then we will see traces of the nature of God in this world. They don't bring us all the way, they don't prove anything, but they are astonishingly suggestive and deeply rich in their implications. And for me, one of the most intellectually exciting things to do is to follow through on these clues that are embedded in nature to the meaning of life and why you and I are here.